There's a photograph that exists in the Jefferson County archives that no one talks about anymore. It shows 4 children standing in front of a farmhouse in the winter of 1975. Their eyes are hollow, their clothes are torn, and behind them, barely visible in the window, is a shape that looks almost human. The police who found them that day were ordered never to speak about what they saw inside. 2 of them quit the force within a month. 1 moved across the country and changed his name. The children were separated immediately, their files sealed by court order. But 30 years later, when one of them finally broke their silence, what they revealed about the Hargraves family made investigators wish they had burned that house to the ground the day they found it. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is what happened when the authorities opened the door to the Hargraves farmhouse on January 14, 1975, and why the county has tried to erase it from memory ever since. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Hargraves family had lived on the same 200 acres in rural Jefferson County since 1893. For 3 generations, they kept to themselves. The farmhouse sat nearly 4 miles from the nearest paved road, hidden behind a dense wall of pine trees that seemed to grow thicker every year, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow the property whole. Neighbors who remembered the family from the 1950s and 60s described them as peculiar but harmless. They attended church sporadically. They sold eggs and vegetables at the farmer's market in town, but they never invited anyone onto their property. Never allowed visitors. Never explained why their children stopped going to school after the 3rd or 4th grade. By 1974, most people in the county had forgotten the Hargraves family existed at all. The parents, Martin and Constance Hargraves, had become reclusive to the point of invisibility. They made rare trips into town for supplies, always alone, always silent. And their 4 children, ranging in age from 7 to 14, had not been seen by anyone outside the family in more than 6 years. No one questioned it. This was rural America in the 1970s. Families were private. The government stayed out of people's business. And if something dark was happening behind closed doors, well, that was between a family and God. But on the morning of January 14, 1975, a postal worker named Eugene Marsh was driving his route when he noticed something that made his blood turn cold. The mailbox at the end of the Hargraves' long gravel driveway was overflowing. Letters and packages, some postmarked from weeks earlier, were stuffed inside and spilling onto the ground. Eugene had been delivering mail for 17 years, and he knew what an overflowing mailbox meant. Either someone had died, or something terrible had happened. He sat in his truck for nearly 10 minutes, debating whether to drive up that long driveway. He told investigators later that he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a primal instinct screaming at him to turn around and leave. But he didn't. He drove up that driveway, parked in front of the house, and knocked on the door. No one answered. He knocked again. Still nothing. And that's when he heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere inside the house. Rhythmic, desperate, like fingernails on wood. Eugene Marsh didn't open the door. He ran back to his truck, drove straight to the sheriff's office, and told them something was very wrong at the Hargraves farm. Sheriff Daniel Crowley dispatched 2 deputies, men named Thomas Gill and Robert Henshaw, to perform a welfare check. They arrived at the property just after noon. The house looked abandoned. The windows were covered with thick curtains that hadn't been opened in years. The front porch was rotting, and there was a smell coming from somewhere on the property that both men would later describe as sweet and rotten at the same time, like spoiled meat mixed with something chemical they couldn't identify. Deputy Gill knocked on the door and announced their presence. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time, and shouted that they were coming inside. Still nothing. Henshaw tried the door handle. It was unlocked. The door swung open with a long, grinding creak, and both men were hit with a wave of cold air that seemed to come from deep inside the house. The interior was dark. The electricity had been shut off, or maybe it had never been connected at all. They used their flashlights to navigate through the front hallway, and what they saw made them stop in their tracks. The walls were covered in writing, thousands of words, scratched and carved and written in what looked like charcoal and dried blood. Bible verses, apologies, confessions. Some of the writing was so small and frantic that it was impossible to read, and in between the words were drawings, crude, disturbing images of figures with elongated limbs and faces that didn't look quite human. Deputy Gill later told a psychologist that the drawings reminded him of something a child would make if they were trying to draw a nightmare they couldn't fully remember. They moved deeper into the house, calling out for anyone who might be there. The scratching sound had stopped. The silence was worse. Every room they entered was filled with the same chaotic writing, the same disturbing drawings. Furniture was overturned. Plates of food, long since rotted, sat on tables. And in the kitchen, they found something that made Deputy Henshaw vomit on the spot. A large metal tub, the kind used for washing clothes, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Floating in the liquid were dozens of dead birds. Crows, mostly. Their wings had been removed, their eyes were gone, and arranged around the tub, in a perfect circle, were small handprints pressed into the dust on the floor. The handprints of children. The deputies were about to call for backup when they heard it. A voice. Small, barely a whisper. Coming from somewhere upstairs. Deputy Gill drew his weapon and slowly climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The voice grew louder as he reached the second floor. It was a child's voice, singing something that sounded like a nursery rhyme, but the words were wrong, twisted. He couldn't make them out clearly, but they made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. At the end of the hallway was a closed door. The singing was coming from behind it. Gill approached slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He turned it, pushed the door open, and what he saw inside that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. 4 children were huddled together in the corner of an almost empty bedroom, 3 girls and 1 boy. Their ages were difficult to determine at first because they were so malnourished, their faces gaunt and pale, their bodies small and fragile. The oldest girl, who they would later learn was 14-year-old Sarah Hargraves, was holding the youngest child in her arms, rocking back and forth. None of them reacted when the door opened. None of them looked at the deputies. They just kept staring at the wall opposite them, where something had been written in large, shaking letters. He comes when we sleep. Deputy Henshaw, who had followed Gill upstairs, immediately radioed for an ambulance and child protective services. He approached the children slowly, speaking in a soft voice, telling them they were safe now. But when he got close enough to touch them, the oldest girl finally turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were empty, completely devoid of emotion, and in a voice that sounded decades older than her years, she said something that made both deputies freeze. She said, "You shouldn't have opened the door. Now he knows you're here." The children were removed from the house within the hour. Paramedics who arrived on the scene described their condition as severe neglect bordering on torture. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in bruises and scars that appeared to be both recent and years old. The youngest child, a 7-year-old boy named Michael, had never been registered with any school or government agency. As far as official records were concerned, he didn't exist. None of the children spoke during the transport to the hospital. They didn't cry. They didn't ask questions. They just sat in silence, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering to each other in a language that didn't sound like English. The search for Martin and Constance Hargraves began immediately. Every room in the house was examined, every closet, every crawl space, every corner of the property, but the parents were nowhere to be found. What investigators did find, however, was evidence of something far more disturbing than simple neglect. In the basement, accessible only through a trapdoor hidden beneath a rug in the kitchen, they discovered a room that had been converted into something between a chapel and a prison cell. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was stained with substances that were later confirmed to be blood, animal, and human. In the center of the room was a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. Scratch marks covered every surface within reach of that chair. And hanging on the wall, directly facing whoever would be sitting there, was a massive portrait. It was painted in dark, thick oils, and it depicted a figure that investigators struggled to describe in their official reports. Most said it looked like a man, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the face too smooth, with eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood in the room. Beneath the portrait was a small altar, covered in melted candle wax, dead flowers, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Martin Hargraves, and what was written inside provided the first real glimpse into what had been happening in that house for years. The entries began in 1968 and continued sporadically until just days before the children were found. The early entries were relatively normal, discussing farming, weather, and minor family matters. But by 1970, the tone had shifted dramatically. Martin wrote about visions he'd been having, about a presence he felt watching the family at night. He described hearing voices that told him his children were impure, that they needed to be cleansed through suffering and isolation. He wrote about Constance, supporting him, about how she too had begun to see the figure in their dreams. They called it the shepherd. They believed it had chosen their family for a divine purpose, and they believed that by keeping their children locked away from the corrupting influence of the outside world, by subjecting them to what Martin called spiritual correction, they were saving their souls. The final entry in the journal was dated January 10, 1975, 4 days before the children were found. It consisted of only one sentence, written in handwriting so shaky it was almost illegible. "The shepherd has asked for us, and we must go to him now." The bodies of Martin and Constance Hargraves were discovered 3 days later, nearly 2 miles from the farmhouse, deep in the woods that bordered their property. They were found by a search team that had been combing the area with dogs. What made the discovery so unsettling wasn't just that they were dead, it was the way they had died and the state in which they were found. Both bodies were hanging from separate trees, roughly 50 feet apart. They had clearly been dead for several days, likely since around the time of that final journal entry. But here's what made no sense to investigators. There were no ladders nearby, no stumps or rocks they could have stood on. The branches they hung from were at least 10 feet off the ground, and most disturbing of all, there were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Their hands were positioned at their sides, almost peacefully. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies stated in his report that he could find no logical explanation for how 2 people could have hanged themselves from branches that high without any means of reaching them. But there was something else, something that was kept out of the official reports and only whispered about among the investigators who were there that day. Both bodies had been mutilated post-mortem. Their eyes had been removed with what appeared to be surgical precision, and carved into their foreheads, in symbols that matched some of the drawings found on the walls of the farmhouse, were markings that a religious studies professor later identified as a bastardized combination of various occult and Christian iconography. Someone, or something, had performed a ritual on these bodies after they died. The investigation into the Hargraves case was quietly shut down within 6 weeks. The official cause of death was ruled as a joint suicide brought on by shared psychotic disorder. The house was seized by the county, and there was talk of demolishing it. But legal implications with the property deed kept that from happening. Instead, it simply sat there, empty and decaying, for years. Locals avoided it, stories spread, and the 4 Hargraves children disappeared into the foster care system, their identities protected, their records sealed by court order. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. For nearly 3 decades, the story of the Hargraves family existed only as a dark footnote in Jefferson County history. The people who remembered it didn't talk about it. The investigators who worked the case moved on with their lives, though several admitted years later that they never really moved on at all. And the children, now scattered across different states with different names, tried to build lives out of the ruins of their childhood. But in 2004, something happened that brought the entire nightmare back into the light. Sarah Hargraves, the oldest of the 4 children, broke her silence. She was 43 years old, living under a different name in Oregon, working as a librarian, and by all outward appearances, living a normal life. But the truth, as she would later reveal in a series of interviews with the investigative journalist, was that she had never escaped that house. Not really. The memories followed her everywhere. The nightmares never stopped. And after years of therapy and countless failed attempts to move forward, she made the decision to tell the world what really happened in that farmhouse. What Sarah described was beyond anything investigators had imagined. She explained that the abuse had started gradually when she was around 8 years old, in 1969. Her father had become obsessed with religious texts, but not the Bible her family had grown up reading. He had acquired books from somewhere, books with strange symbols and writings in languages she didn't recognize. He began conducting ceremonies in the basement, forcing the children to participate. He told them they were being prepared for something important, that they had been chosen. The punishments started small. Hours spent kneeling in prayer, days without food for perceived sins. But they escalated quickly. Her father built that chair in the basement, the one with the leather straps, and he would force them to sit in it while he read from his books and performed what he called purification rituals. Sometimes, these sessions lasted for hours. Sometimes, they lasted for days. Her mother stood by and watched, occasionally participating, convinced that they were doing God's work. But here's what Sarah said that sent chills through everyone who heard it. She insisted that her parents weren't entirely wrong about something being in that house. She described a presence that she and her siblings all felt, especially at night. She said there were times when she would wake up and see a figure standing in the corner of their room, tall and impossibly thin, watching them with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. She said her siblings saw it too. They all did. And while her father claimed he was communicating with this entity, Sarah believed that whatever it was had been feeding on their suffering, growing stronger with each act of cruelty inflicted in that house. The other 3 Hargraves children were eventually located by journalists following Sarah's revelations. 2 of them refused to speak publicly, but the third, Rebecca, who had been 12 years old when they were found, confirmed every detail of Sarah's account. She added that in the final months before they were rescued, their parents had become completely consumed by their belief in the shepherd. They barely ate, they barely slept. They spent almost all their time in the basement, preparing for what they called the final offering. Rebecca believed that offering was supposed to be the children, that their parents had been planning to kill them as some form of sacrifice. And if that postal worker hadn't noticed the overflowing mailbox, if those deputies had arrived even a week later, she was certain none of them would have survived. The public response to Sarah's revelations was immediate and intense. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Mental health professionals analyzed the case as an extreme example of folie à famille, a shared psychotic disorder that can affect entire family units. Religious scholars debated whether Martin Hargraves had been influenced by legitimate occult texts or had simply created his own delusional theology. But for the people of Jefferson County, the story brought back memories they had tried to bury for 3 decades. Former Deputy Thomas Gill, now retired and living in Florida, agreed to speak about the case for the first time in 2005. He described returning to the Hargraves farmhouse multiple times in his dreams, always finding himself back in that basement, staring at that portrait on the wall. He admitted that he had requested a transfer to a different county within months of finding the children because he couldn't drive past that property without feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. He said something else too, something that never made it into any official report. On the day they found the children, after they had been taken to the hospital, he and Deputy Henshaw returned to the house to secure the scene. They went back down to the basement, and the portrait was different. He swore the figure in the painting had changed position, that it was no longer facing forward but turned slightly, as if looking toward the stairs. Henshaw saw it too. They both did. They never mentioned it to anyone because they knew how it would sound. The farmhouse itself became the subject of intense interest. Paranormal investigators requested access. True crime enthusiasts tried to locate the property, but the county had finally taken action. In 2006, after years of legal wrangling, the house was demolished. Every board, every brick, every piece of that structure was removed and incinerated. The land was sold to a development company that planned to build new homes on the site. But construction never began. Workers reported equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and an overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. The project was abandoned. The land sits empty to this day, marked only by a small historical marker that makes no mention of what happened there. It simply states that the property was once home to a family farm established in 1893. The four Hargraves children have all requested privacy in the years since their story became public. Sarah passed away in 2019 from cancer. Before her death, she gave one final interview in which she was asked if she believed her parents were evil or simply mentally ill. Her answer was chilling. She said that evil and illness aren't always separate things, that sometimes evil finds people who are vulnerable and broken, and it uses them. She said she had forgiven her parents years ago because holding on to that anger was just another way that house could keep her trapped. But she also said she would never forgive whatever it was that had been in that basement, watching them, feeding on their pain. She said she still felt it sometimes, even decades later and thousands of miles away, a presence at the edge of her awareness, waiting, watching, patient. The case of the Hargraves family remains one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse and shared delusion in American history. But for those who lived through it, for those who saw what was in that house, it represents something darker. A reminder that there are places where human cruelty and something unexplainable intersect, where the line between psychological horror and something genuinely otherworldly becomes impossible to define. The children were found in 1975. They were rescued. They survived, but what they brought with them from that farmhouse, the memories and the scars and the presence that still haunts them, suggests that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The Hargraves family is gone. The house is gone. But on certain nights, people who live near that empty plot of land still report seeing lights moving through the trees where the farmhouse once stood. They report hearing voices, children's voices, singing something that sounds like a lullaby, but with words that make no sense. Words that sound like they're calling something home.